February 26, 1993 was a typical chilly Friday morning in New York City. The streets below the towering World Trade Center hummed with life. The shuffle of commuters, the honking of taxicabs, and the clatter of coffee carts serving the city that never sleeps. Inside the Twin Towers, life unfolded like any other day. Office workers settled into their routines, taking calls, sipping coffee, and glancing at the panoramic views of Manhattan that stretched out before them. In the bustling underground concourse, shoppers browsed the stores and the aroma of fresh bagels filled the air. But lurking in the shadows, an unspeakable act was already in motion. Unbeknownst to those going about their day in the towers, a rented van crept into the parking garage beneath the North Tower, carrying a deadly payload, including 1,300 pounds of nitrate fertilizer, hydrogen gas cylinders, and cyanide. 6 men, fueled by hatred and radical ideologies, had spent months preparing for this moment. Their plan was both audacious and monstrous: to topple one of the Twin Towers into the other, killing potentially up to 250,000 innocent civilians. 18 minutes past noon, the van detonated. The blast tore through the underground parking garage, ripping a massive hole through 5 sublevels, sending a fireball racing up elevator shafts. Smoke billowed into offices and stairwells, plunging the tower into darkness. Terrified workers screamed, stumbled through thick smoke, and groped their way down stairwells that seemed endless. On the street above, chaos erupted. Emergency vehicles swarmed the scene as flames licked out from the gaping crater below. Their sirens weren't enough to drown out the wailing of the victims. Paramedics rushed to aid the injured, while firefighters navigated the smoke-filled labyrinth beneath the towers. The attack claimed 6 lives, each a tragic loss, and injured more than 1,000. But it could have been worse. The explosion wasn't large enough to knock out the tower's structural supports. Whereas they had hoped to bring down both towers, neither collapsed on that day. Still, it was a stark warning, a harbinger of the devastation that would come less than a decade later. The mastermind of this 1993 attack wasn't Osama Bin Laden, however. It took 2 years to catch Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind who had gone into hiding in Pakistan. His involvement was quickly discovered as one of the bombers returned to the van's rental company in an ill-begotten attempt to reclaim his $400 deposit for the destroyed vehicle. Youssef, the blind sheikh who had issued the fatwa which authorized the attack, and his joint ties to a certain former freedom fighter from the Afghan war were soon revealed to the wider public. For the first time, the American intelligence community had Osama bin Laden on their radar. The lasting question that this episode hopes to answer is, why did they wait so long to take their shot? Although the towers withstood the attack that day, their foundations had been tested. The first strike on the World Trade Center, a moment that foreshadowed the horrors of September 11, 2001, introduced America to a new, terrifying era of terrorism. PBS interviewed Andrew Colabella, a cousin of one of the 6 victims, who claims that the 93 World Trade Center bombing was the powder keg for the 9/11 attacks. Yet the earlier attack is largely remembered as a blip, rather than a siren in the history of international terror. These 2 historical events that have taken place should be instilled in our hearts and minds, he says, to think united and be united. Americans quickly forgot that lesson, but the growing jihadist community took it and other dishonorable lessons from the attack, eventually coalescing around the new rising power of Terrorism Incorporated, better known as Al-Qaeda. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the terrorist Osama Bin Laden. Episode number 3, Unhappy Homecoming. Bin Laden emerged from the wreckage of the Afghan-Soviet War a triumphant hero. His 15 minutes of fame had run out, however, and he, like many who experience unexpected renown, couldn't come to grips with the fact that the world had moved on. The phenomenon is a very real thing that psychologists are looking at. While the chasing of social media dopamine hits are most commonly talked about, a new subgroup has begun to argue that the American Congress is so dysfunctional because congressmen are chasing viral moments and the publicity that comes with it, rather than trying to make people's lives better. Illusions of grandeur had seeped into Osama bin Laden to such a degree that his systems were fully rewired. Although the process had begun with Osama attempting to honorably imitate the Prophet Muhammad's life, steps had been taken which suggest that al-Qaeda's leader began to see himself as the holy man's successor. The terrorist himself would have steadfastly rejected such a claim, as it amounted to a grave sin, with the first pillar of Islam clearly establishing the Prophet's place. As the Afghan war progressed, bin Laden's radicalization increased. He went from an innocent small-time donor to bankrolling the Mujahideen's entire propaganda effort. He had initially only tiptoed across the border to see the troops, before creating his own den filled with a private army. This included a loyalty oath made not to Allah, not even to the cause, but an oath of loyalty to him personally. He married 3 additional wives during the conflict, each of whom claimed to have direct blood ties to the Prophet Muhammad himself. That fact matters, as one of the Prophet's first converts was a 10-year-old child named Ali. That child would become the son-in-law of the Prophet by marrying Muhammad's daughter. He shared bread with him, served as his personal decoy for assassination attempts, and was named the 4th Caliph after Muhammad left this world behind. In the succession battles that followed, Ali's familiar relations became critical to his resume, resulting in a literal schism in the faith, with Shiites immediately adopting him as their ruler. One doesn't search out 3 known female descendants of the same man unless he is trying to follow closely in his footsteps. Psychologist Maria Miloro used the available data in 2006 to publish an article in the International Journal of Applied Psychoanalytical Studies. She writes that, in assessing bin Laden's personality from the data that are available, 3 features are prominent: archaic narcissistic states, paranoia, and a Manichean sense of reality, which describes a clear belief in good versus evil. It is shown that his ideology derives from his personality and his perception of and reaction to political events involving the United States and nations in the Middle East. The findings suggest that bin Laden imagines that he is walking in the shoes of the Prophet Muhammad as he engages in an apocalyptic war to restore Islam as a potent force in the world. Osama bin Laden is compared to Hitler as a charismatic, messianic leader. Osama's viewpoint that he had single-handedly won the Afghan war wasn't shared by his homeland of Saudi Arabia. Although he had played a role, including risking his life on multiple occasions, Osama bin Laden didn't affect the outcome. His Arab forces, hell-bent on martyrdom, had participated in a few battles, but the work of wearing down the Red Army had been done by hundreds of thousands of Mujahideen warriors from Afghanistan and the nearby territories of Pakistan and Central Asia. But you couldn't explain that to the overjoyed bin Laden, who ignored the Sunni tradition of avoiding the celebration of one's own birthday to claim to one of his wives that the Soviet withdrawal, which happened to coincide on his 32nd birthday, was a gift to him. The delusional behavior only grew worse, as he set up a special organization known as the Legion of the Prophet, which would consist of 314 al-Qaeda operatives, the exact number of warriors that Muhammad had led at the Battle of Badr. Surviving notes from a meeting in 1988 reveal Osama's intentions to lead this legion against America. Although grand in its ambitions, it was a tiny group that heard his proclamation. Just 9 men. Still, it was from that meeting that would begin a global jihad culminating in the American-led War on Terror, an ongoing conflict that has claimed nearly 5 million lives. For the cause, he received an infusion of $10 million in cash inheritance after his brother Salim, the head of the Bin Laden construction company, perished in yet another plane crash. Family members believe that Salim had been the only person who could have talked Osama away from his chosen path. Another guardrail was removed in 1989 as his mentor, Azam Abdullah, was assassinated via a car bomb in Pakistan. Journalist Peter Bergen tells us that, with Azam gone, there was little to counter al-Qaeda's militant ideas among the Afghan Arabs. It was around this time that al-Qaeda drew up a draft of its bylaws that ran to 19 pages. The bylaws made it clear that the group's sole purpose was to wage jihad anywhere in the Islamic world, and that it would not be distracted, as it hid beneath Azam, by relief and aid projects. Osama bankrolled the project himself, setting up a salary structure, healthcare benefits, and furniture allowances. He went so far as to include progressive measures, including automatic annual cost of living raises, as well as 2 additional weeks of sick leave for anybody who served on the front lines. The Soviets finished withdrawing from Afghanistan on February 15, 1989. Shortly afterwards, Osama bin Laden returned home to Saudi Arabia to continue his work for the family construction business, momentarily trading his AK-47 for a set of bulldozer keys. It's unlikely that he could have ever settled back into normal life, but the rise of Saddam Hussein on the international stage ensured that the al-Qaeda leader wouldn't rest for long. Islam doesn't believe itself to be a religion, positioning itself instead as a way of life. To explain the distinction to my students, I use 2 familiar characters from The Simpsons. Ned Flanders, a Protestant Christian on the show, is portrayed as literally thinking about God and his faith 24/7. Religion permeates every single moment of his life. Homer Simpson, on the other hand, attends the exact same church as Ned, but only seems to think about his faith while he is physically stuck in church. Even then, the show regularly depicts him fast asleep in the pew, unable to meditate on God's gift for even an hour a week. For Ned Flanders, faith is his way of life. Every decision passes through the calculus of what would Jesus do. For Homer, however, faith is something that can be forgotten, ignored, and muted in order to do whatever immoral action he wants, while still retaining his church's get-out-of-hell-free card for the attendance he gives once a week. Islam never wanted to be relegated to being just a religion. That is why it remains a tradition among the faithful to host a massive celebration for the first time somebody finishes reading the Quran. No such obligation exists for the 2.4 billion Christians in the world. A research study by Lifeway reveals that only 20%, 1 out of every 5 Christians, have read the Bible in its entirety, while half of them have consumed little to none of their holy book. Muslims also heed a call to prayer 5 times a day. This serves as a constant reminder to adhere to their faith every few hours. The result is a Ned Flanders-esque mindset, allowing them to face any and all upcoming challenges with the mindset of what would Allah do? Of course, for Osama, the question seems to have been, what would the Prophet Muhammad do? Saddam Hussein was the type of ruler whom Middle Eastern religious adherents despised, as he had proved himself to be a brutal secular dictator who would switch from using the faith to justify beating down his own people to punishing those same people at other times for those beliefs. Back in Season 2 of this show, I examined the rise and fall of the Iraqi dictator. If you don't know much about why the world hated Saddam, I would encourage you to listen to those shows. For this one, I will merely recount the basics needed to understand the feud between Saddam and Osama. In 1975, the Shatt al-Arab, a critical waterway connecting the Tigris and Euphrates to the Persian Gulf, was evenly divided between Iran and Iraq. 5 years after the partition, Iraq crossed the boundary, beginning the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam's reasoning was sound, as he was attempting to position himself as a new Nasser, a Middle Eastern leader and adherent of Pan-Arabism who sought to unite the region beneath his rule. At the time, Iran was in a state of complete disarray, as the newly empowered Ayatollah Khomeini continued to rely on violence in his attempt to establish a Shiite theocracy. Since 80% of the Muslim world identified as Sunni, Saddam feared little backlash. Meanwhile, he was subtly being encouraged by the United States, whose citizens were being held hostage in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. Last but not least, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in order to steal their oil. It was a simple plan that looks great if you don't stop to consider the consequences. In order to finance the war, Saddam borrowed money at high interest rates from the tiny oil-rich nation of Kuwait. After a quick war, he would sue for peace, keep the oil fields that he seized, and use their profits to pay back Kuwait. Gamblers make the same mistake on a daily basis, chasing a bad bet by borrowing enough money to lay down a second can't-miss bet to pay off the previous loss. While the logic remains sound, social media is full of videos of down bad bets, the result of which is typically a hole in a wall and a broken hand. Against all expectations, Iran's people rallied around their newly established government, forcing Saddam into a desperate war of attrition. When Iranian counterstrikes stole the momentum and exposed Iraq to invasion, Saddam used chemical weapons to steer the war back into a costly stalemate. Rather than a quick victory, the war went on for 8 brutal years, becoming the costliest and most murderous conflict since World War II, as 1 million souls departed from this world. There were more than $200 billion in direct costs and another $1 trillion in indirect costs as both sides began to target oil tankers traversing the Persian Gulf. It gets worse when you remember that Iraq had financed it under the belief that it would be adding Iran's oil fields to its own. Once everything was said and done, however, the border remained unchanged, and Kuwait, Saddam's bookie, was demanding repayment. Faced with no good option, Saddam doubled down, invading Kuwait on August 2, 1990. That decision would unleash a series of dominoes which would lead directly to September 11, 2001. The actual origins of bin Laden's hatred towards America are difficult to pin down. Decades in the public eye as the de facto global leader of jihad has created a contradictory paper trail. Sometimes the origin story is the 1967 Israeli Six-Day War, as it eliminated hope for Palestinian self-rule. Although the U.S. wasn't directly involved in the conflict, they were perceived by most as the de facto backers of the Israeli state. Thus, whatever Israel did, America took a share of the blame. In support of this being the source of Osama's American angst, the terrorist's 2002 letter to America claimed that the expansion of Israel is one of the greatest crimes, and you are the leaders of its criminals. And of course, there is no need to explain and prove the degree of American support for Israel. The creation of Israel is a crime which must be erased. Each and every person whose hands have become polluted in the contribution towards this crime must pay its price and pay for it heavily. But despite the intense rhetoric, Elliot Neiman points out that bin Laden never actually lifted a finger to help the Palestinian cause, always instead focusing on America and not Israel. The historian instead suggests that bin Laden's Palestinian rhetoric was merely a way to gain the favor of militant Muslims, adopting their cause in name only as though it were his own. Other times, bin Laden would identify the 1983 Marine base bombing in Beirut, Lebanon as his inspiration. That attack, which Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg reminds us, was the deadliest day in U.S. Marine history since Iwo Jima. It was also the single deadliest attack on Americans anywhere in the world before 9/11, and the single deadliest terrorist attack on Americans overseas ever. The Hezbollah strike also resulted in Ronald Reagan ordering the swift withdrawal of American troops from Lebanon, convincing bin Laden that America's response to a swift punch to the face was enough to make the U.S. withdraw from where they were unwelcome. While the creation of Israel and the Beirut bombings are the most plausible explanations, there were also some random fly-on-the-wall thoughts given as well. At one point, he proclaimed that our general debauchery, including the support for gay rights, was the reason he targeted us. At another, he made an environmental justification, suggesting that our destruction would result in far less greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere. In a 1998 fatwa, he revealed that he hated us because of the sweeping sanctions we put upon Iraq in an effort to inspire Saddam's people to rise up and depose him. That led Middle Eastern specialist Michael Rubin to title an article, "Sanctions on Iraq, a Valid Anti-American Grievance?" Although the numbers are impossible to pin down, as most deaths would have been indirect, as sanctions reduce the ability for families to purchase food, which leads to malnutrition, which in turn makes you more susceptible to dying from disease. Some credible estimates, however, suggest that the sanctions led to 1 million deaths. In 2004, bin Laden called the sanctions the greatest mass slaughter of children mankind has ever known. I won't shy away from the fact that America makes mistakes. I was old enough to support the Oil for Food program, which sought to alleviate some of the harm of the sanctions. I also remember feeling ashamed when it was discovered that the program had been manipulated to ensure that Saddam remained in power at the expense of his own people. Clearly, there were flaws. Despite this, citizens going about their everyday business in New York had nothing to do with decisions made by the Oval Office. Bin Laden, like others that target civilians in protest of government policy, had an overly simplistic view of American politics, equating democracy with the will of the voters. In his mind, the president was selected by the people. Therefore, the people were responsible for the policies imposed by the president. This obviously ignores some key facts. First, nearly half the country doesn't vote. Second, half of those that do vote voted for the other candidate. Third, lobbyists and corporate interests, particularly the military-industrial complex, typically have an oversized amount of influence in comparison to the voters. Fourth, the Electoral College elects the president, making the election come down to just a handful of swing states. Finally, the vast majority of those who voted did for a single issue reason that is personal to them or an economic kitchen table issue, and not the policy in question. Although his justifications varied, there is one reason that serves as a through line for all of them: America stationing troops in his homeland in the aftermath of Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait to avoid paying them back for the failed Iran war. Bin Laden, who was struggling to field his 314-man Legion of the Prophet, offered Saudi Arabia 100,000 experienced Mujahideen warriors to protect against Saddam, whom he referred to as both an apostate as well as using Samuel L. Jackson's favorite curse word. Saudi Arabia, however, chose to turn to a more reliable partner, one that actually had troops at its disposal. Under the codename Desert Shield, 500,000 American troops, including women who didn't abide by the stringent dress code that had been instituted in the wake of the takeover of the Grand Mosque, Bin Laden informed anyone who would listen that the Americans would never leave, reminding everyone that the Prophet had decreed that only adherents to Islam could reign on the peninsula, claiming that in their actions, the Saudis revealed that they were more afraid of Saddam Hussein than Allah himself. It wasn't an unreasonable thought. At the time of deployment, Iraq had the undeserved reputation of possessing one of the greatest armies on the planet. This was despite the evidence provided in the failed Iran War. A simple look at the map, however, fanned the flames of Saudi fear, crowding out their ability to think rationally. Iraq sits directly in the center of Iran, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. In 1980, Saddam had invaded his northern neighbor to seize the adjacent oil fields. In 1990, he invaded his eastern neighbor in order to seize their petroleum fields. Where were Saudi Arabia's reserves? You guessed it, directly along Iraq's southern border. Saddam had even alluded to the fact that they were his next target. Historian Barry Rubin explains that in a speech to an Arab summit, Saddam told the Middle East that they had three options. They could give up, wait until Europe was stronger, and play it off against America, or unite behind a strong leader who could defeat the United States. Americans, he insisted, feared military confrontations and losses. It had shown signs of fatigue, frustration, and hesitation in Vietnam and Iran, and had quickly run away from Lebanon when some Marines were killed by suicide bombers in 1983. Experience had shown, he concluded, that if Iraq acted boldly, America would do nothing. These declarations were a way to make the Arab world forget all the unpleasant lessons of history and follow a new leader into another dangerous adventure. The best way to unite the Middle East beneath his rule was the consolidation of the region's most precious resource. There are two distinct reasons that Saudi Arabia refused Iraq's siren call. First, Saddam was a secular barbarian who manipulated Islam for his own gain. And secondly, the United States at the time had a decidedly favorable foreign policy regarding the Middle East. Rubin continues, pointing out that the United States, like all countries, has tried to pursue a foreign policy that accords with its own interests. But the fact remains that these interests have generally coincided with those of Arab leaders and peoples. For example, the United States may have had its own reasons for saving Kuwait from annexation by Iraq's secular dictatorship in 1991, mainly to preserve cheap oil. But U.S. policy was still in effect pro-Kuwaiti, pro-Muslim, and pro-Arab. After all, Washington could have used the war as a pretext to seize Kuwait's oil fields for itself or demand lower prices or political concessions in exchange for fighting off Iraq. Instead, U.S. leaders did none of these things and sought the widest possible support for their actions among Arabs and Muslims. Deciding to roll out the welcome mat for America meant silencing its most vocal critic, resulting in Osama bin Laden being placed under house arrest. There's a lot of dispute as to what happened next, with some claiming that the House of Saud dispatched assassins to permanently silence their troublesome citizen, while others believe that the bin Laden family used their extensive resources to safely spirit him out of the country in the dead of night. Either way, he would never again return to the land of his birth. Exiled, Osama returned to Afghanistan, working with subordinates to assassinate the aging king of Saudi Arabia. The initial plan involved a female suicide bomber. That was rejected after it was determined that the resulting explosion would likely harm the king's grandson. His rejection revealed that the 9/11 mastermind hadn't yet tossed his morals to the wayside, rejecting the plan by stating, "We are Muslims, we don't eliminate children. I would rather have the king return and have a civil war than kill a child." The plan that they did authorize involved presenting the monarch an ornate dagger, which the Al-Qaeda agent would then snatch and stab the aging monarch several times. On this particular day, Allah seemed to smile upon the ruler of the kingdom, as a tin of cigars kept in his shirt's front pocket blocked the knife blows from his flesh, preventing death from taking him. It was the first time that Al-Qaeda had engaged in international terrorism. Quickly identified for his role in the assassination attempt, bin Laden was forced to flee Afghanistan in favor of Sudan. The African nation of Sudan was undergoing significant political, social, and economic transformation in 1991, creating conditions that made it an appealing destination for a wealthy terrorist on the run. An Islamist military dictatorship had come to power 2 years earlier. Despite the nation's ethnic and religious diversity, the new government imposed Sharia, or Quranic law. This governing vision was attractive to Islamist movements worldwide, turning Sudan into a hub for Islamic revivalism as well as a safe haven for those with sinister aims. Bin Laden was technically brought in under the guise of a financial partner, tying his portion of the Bin Laden construction company to the ruling government in order to bring about legitimate infrastructure projects, particularly roads. Situated at the crossroads of the Middle East, the Sahara, and the Horn of Africa, Sudan provided bin Laden access to neighboring countries where Islamist movements were active, particularly Egypt, Somalia, and Eritrea. The nation's impoverished state allowed him to maintain the public face of an international businessman who was just as interested in the good that his projects could do as the money that he would make off of them. In private, however, he was restructuring Al-Qaeda and planning attacks across the globe. Bergen tells us that bin Laden's half-decade sojourn in Sudan was a pivotal moment in his life. He built the foundations of his anti-American terrorist organization, supporting militants in Somalia and Yemen who were intent on attacking American targets. He made plans to bomb U.S. embassies in Africa, and some of his followers made unsuccessful efforts to acquire weapons of mass destruction. For his family, however, it was a 100-degree nightmare, as his 4 wives and 14 children were forced to go without air conditioning and refrigerators under the belief that they were distractions from what really mattered. His actions suggest that the family sincerely tried to make Sudan their home. Osama formed the Exile construction firm, employing 600 people while building a new 500-mile-long road between Sudan's 2 largest cities. Diversifying his portfolio, he invested in a farming business which secured a near monopoly over the nation's key agricultural exports, as well as a trucking company, a leather tannery, a furniture-making business, and even a small bakery. But it wasn't all rosy. Bin Laden's tannery came about after the government of Sudan stiffed him on payment for 200 miles of constructed road, handing over the leather factory instead. Amidst his complaining, assassins proceeded to shoot up his offices. The Guardian writes that in 1995, 4 activists from an ultra-extreme Egyptian group which considers modern-day Islam so corrupt that it would be best to start over, opened fire in a mosque, killing 12 people. Afterwards, they jumped into a Toyota pickup and went hunting for bin Laden, whom they judged offensively liberal. According to former neighbors, the Toyota screamed to a stop outside bin Laden's offices, opposite his house, and even before getting out, the occupants opened fire. Shots were returned immediately from the offices and from the roof of the house. Within minutes, 1 man lay dead in the street, 2 or 3 in the offices, and 3 in the pickup. The 4th attacker was hung. America was also growing aware of Osama bin Laden. An Egyptian magazine blew his paper-thin cover by titling an article, "A Millionaire Finances Extremism in Egypt and Saudi Arabia." His action taken in Somalia raised his profile even further. Fresh off the resounding success of the Persian Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush dispatched 28,000 American troops to Somalia on a peacekeeping mission. Bergen, however, notes that bin Laden viewed their mission as part of a larger American strategy to take over the Muslim world. His decision to involve himself in the matter was due to bin Laden's biggest misunderstanding about the West, as he had come to the conclusion that America was a paper tiger. The slang term originates from an old Chinese proverb popularized by Mao Zedong. If you were to spot a paper tiger out of the corner of your eye, you would be terrified and likely run off. But if you summoned the courage or stupidity to check it out, you would realize that it, being made out of paper, is completely harmless. Despite only seeing limited military action in the Soviet-Afghan War, Osama had come to the conclusion that being a quote-unquote world superpower wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. After all, the Mujahideen, largely through grit, determination, and American anti-aircraft technology, had defeated the USSR. When Hezbollah bombed the Marines in Beirut, America responded by packing up its bags and leaving the country. As such, he truly felt that if you whacked America hard enough, we would abandon the Middle East, and that was atop his priority list. He attempted to do this from Sudan, launching a series of mostly ineffective attacks in southern Yemen, the staging ground for America's Somali operations. Next, American oil companies were attacked, resulting in one injury. A few months later, Al-Qaeda attacked a sympathetic Yemen politician. The U.S. Embassy was bombed twice, but there were no injuries. Finally, on December 29, 1992, 2 bombs exploded outside hotels housing servicemen and women being rotated into the Somalian theater. One of the 2 buildings were spared when the device prematurely exploded in the parking lot. The other went off as intended, but only managed to kill a tourist and wound 1 employee. Despite the lack of casualties, the Pentagon received the message, announcing 2 days later that they were suspending operations in Yemen, reinforcing bin Laden's worldview that the West was merely a paper tiger. There are a couple of notable things regarding his attack. First, bin Laden didn't warn America ahead of time, something that he would later claim was essential to maintaining God's acceptance of actions taken in his name. Secondly, although he assumed otherwise, the Bush administration didn't move their operation because of his actions. Instead, they abandoned it based upon intelligence that Iran was looking to expand its sphere of influence in Yemen. While bin Laden celebrated his victory, America remained blissfully unaware of him. There remains no clear evidence of al-Qaeda's involvement in the Somalian Black Hawk Down incident, but the terrorist leaders celebrated it anyways. The public loss of 18 servicemen resulted in America pulling out of the conflict, again confirming Osama's suspicions about the West. It was around this time that the American intelligence community began to focus on al-Qaeda. In the aftermath of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, bin Laden became tangentially linked to the attackers. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the attack, was the nephew of al-Zakari, bin Laden's right-hand man. Youssef had stayed at one of bin Laden's guest houses after the attack, and the construction financier had donated a generous $20,000 to his legal defense team. Elsewhere, bin Laden's writings were mentioned in a manifesto of a terrorist whose car bomb killed 5 Americans and 2 citizens of the Republic of India. The CIA gained an inside look at his operation after one of bin Laden's own operatives was caught stealing $110,000 from the organization and ran to them for help. Soon afterwards, the CIA began snooping around Khartoum, the capital city of Sudan. The threat level there was raised after multiple American embassy workers detected unusual activity from beyond the gates. Rather than pushing the envelope, they decided to close the embassy, cutting themselves off from valuable channels of local information. They also increased diplomatic pressure on Sudan to take action against their now infamous guest, Osama bin Laden. This should have been the end of the story. We knew where bin Laden was, we knew that he was up to no good, and we had the capability to surgically remove the threat. But the rule of law matters. It was impossible for us to take action against him without a superseding indictment, and the evidence remained tangential. Sudan, grateful for Osama's previous finance operations, presented him with an ultimatum. Keep your head down and stay silent for the time being, or hit the road. He chose the latter, taking his operation back to where it had all begun, Afghanistan. It was once again an option, as the king that bin Laden had ordered assassinated has since passed away. Also, the new fundamentalist group calling themselves the Taliban had emerged as the rulers of the graveyard of empires. Still, his return to Afghanistan was an enormous risk for Osama. He didn't have much to offer the new rulers of Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia had frozen his assets, and in his haste to evacuate Sudan, he had left behind $29 million in equipment and other investments. This left him essentially broke. His reputation among the Mujahideen, however, had only grown since he had left. Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, settled Osama and his family in Tora Bora, in a building that has been described as half mud house, half cave. For his family, it was an even harsher lifestyle than they had been forced to put up with in Africa. Despite being fortunate to escape Sudan, he renewed his public relations effort regarding jihad. Seeking to widen his audience, he began to give interviews to British journalists, Arabic newspapers, even CNN. And on August 23, 1996, he issued a statement titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. Despite spelling his intentions out in the clearest possible language, Bergen teaches that bin Laden soon realized that his threats against the United States and his rationales for those threats were going largely unnoticed in the English-speaking world. He had hoped to create the legal framework for a defensive jihad, but was more than willing to work behind the optional offensive jihad model that had been presented by Omar Abdel Rahman. His fatwa on the subject asked his followers to extract revenge for his capture by cutting off all relations with the Americans, Christians, and Jews, tear them to pieces, destroy their economies, burn their corporations, destroy their peace, sink their ships, shoot down their planes, and kill them on air, sea, and land. Once again, I feel that it's necessary to reiterate that Islam is a decentralized religion. If a rogue Catholic priest in Nebraska had issued an order like this, his bosses, the bishops and archbishops, would have put him straight immediately. In a hierarchical church structure like Catholicism, only the Pope would be able to issue such a sweeping interpretation of God's will. In Islam, anyone who achieves cleric status can issue their own interpretation. You don't even need a majority of opinions, as just one will suffice. Case in point, in 2018, 70 scholars from 3 Muslim nations issued a joint fatwa that says unequivocally that violent extremism and terrorism violate the principles of Islam. Those who prefer to believe that Islam is a violent faith will look to the statements of bin Laden and the blind sheikh. But the actions of a few evil men shouldn't condemn millions of others. I recognize that 99% of all Muslims believe in a life of peace, choosing to believe the Prophet Muhammad's own instructions that emphasize how important it is to treat the people of the book, i.e. Jews and Christians, with kindness and empathy, carving out a special place in the world in recognition that the 3 Western faiths all emerge from the same place, a Garden of Eden with Adam, Eve, an apple, and a snake. Just as I wouldn't want my Christian faith to be judged by the actions of the Crusaders, I choose not to judge Islam by the actions of an extremely loud but tiny minority. Bergen writes that the fatwa, with its extortions to shoot down their planes, burn their corporations, and sink their ships, would turn out to be a slow-ticking time bomb that would explode first on October 12, 2000, when a suicide bombing by members of Al-Qaeda blew a hole the size of a small house in the USS Cole in Yemen, killing 17 American sailors, and then again with even greater ferocity on 9/11. In our next episode, we'll examine the escalation of bin Laden's war through the 1998 African embassy attacks and the USS Cole bombing in 2000, as well as document the frantic efforts that the United States intelligence community made to take him out before it was too late. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you'd like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.